"Get your face on the pavement!" Officer Miller screamed, the sickening crack of his heavy boot connecting with the woman's spine echoing off the courthouse steps. He twisted her arm behind her back until the shoulder joint popped, laughing as he pressed her cheek into the dirty, sun-baked concrete. "You look like trash. You get treated like trash," he spat, tightening the handcuffs until they cut into her skin. "That's the law in my town." Miller stood up and grinned at his partner, wiping his hands as if he had just taken out the garbage, while the woman gasped for air, blood dripping from her split lip. But Officer Miller's arrogance had just made him the victim of a catastrophic mistake. He didn't know that the woman in the faded hoodie wasn't a criminal. He didn't know that she wasn't helpless. And he certainly didn't know that in exactly 5 minutes, he would be the one in handcuffs weeping on the floor while she sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison. To truly understand the magnitude of the retribution that was about to rain down on Officer Buck Miller, you first have to witness the cruelty that defined his reign over the small, dust-choked town of Oak Creek. Miller didn't just enforce the law. He was a predator who used his badge as a hunting license. Just 2 hours before he laid hands on the woman in the hoodie, Miller had been patrolling the outskirts of town, looking for prey. He found it in Marcus, a young father driving a rusted sedan with his 6-year-old daughter in the back seat. Miller pulled him over for no reason other than boredom. When Marcus politely asked what he had done wrong, Miller didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the back of the sedan, raised his heavy baton, and smashed the left tail light, the red plastic shattering onto the asphalt. "Broken tail light," Miller smirked, leaning into the window where the terrified child was watching. "Now get out of the car." For 20 agonizing minutes, Miller forced Marcus to kneel in the mud by the roadside, humiliating him, tossing his wallet into a drainage ditch, and threatening to call child services if Marcus dared to wipe the mud from his jeans. The town watched from behind their curtains, paralyzed by a fear so deep it had silenced them for a decade. They knew that in Oak Creek, Officer Miller was the judge, jury, and executioner, and crossing him meant losing everything. But the silence of a small town can scream if you know how to listen, and the screams had finally reached the capital city. Evelyn Vance was a legend in the state's legal circles, a woman known as the Iron Lady, because she broke corruption cases that other prosecutors were too scared to touch. She had grown up in a neighborhood just like Oak Creek, watching bullies with badges destroy her own family, and she had sworn an oath to burn that corruption out wherever she found it. When the file on Officer Miller landed on her desk, thick with reports of beatings, bribes, and false arrests, Evelyn didn't launch a standard investigation. She knew that if she sent a team of suits, Miller would just hide the evidence and put on his good cop face. She needed to see the monster in his natural habitat. So, she left her penthouse, her security detail, and her power suits behind. She dressed in her gardening clothes, a stained gray hoodie, baggy jeans, and scuffed sneakers. She drove a rental car with a dented bumper. She wasn't coming to Oak Creek as the state attorney general. She was coming as the kind of person Miller liked to hurt. She wanted to feel his boot on her neck because she knew that was the only way to make sure he never hurt anyone else again. The scene at the courthouse was a powder keg waiting for a match. It was Saturday, the day of the hearing for a local teenager named Tyrell, whom Miller had framed for a robbery he couldn't possibly have committed. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of stale sweat and desperation. A crowd of 50 people stood at the bottom of the white stone steps, mothers, grandmothers, neighbors, holding signs that said, "Justice for Tyrell." But they stood in silence, terrified of provoking the officers guarding the doors. Evelyn parked her car 2 blocks away and walked slowly toward the building. She kept her head down, her hands shoved deep into her hoodie pockets, blending in with the tired, frightened crowd. She watched Officer Miller, standing at the top of the stairs like a king surveying his subjects. He was laughing with his partner, Officer Jenkins, pointing at the crowd and making jokes about their clothes, their hair, their poverty. He looked comfortable. He looked safe. Evelyn felt a cold, hard rage settle in her chest, a focus that narrowed the world down to a single point. She walked through the crowd, feeling their fear, and started climbing the stairs. She was walking into the lion's den without a weapon, armed only with the truth hidden in the lining of her purse. Miller spotted her when she was halfway up the stairs. To him, she was nothing more than an annoyance, a piece of urban debris that had drifted into his pristine town. "Hey, you! The one in the trashy hoodie!" His voice cracked across the plaza like a whip, causing the crowd below to flinch. Evelyn stopped but didn't look up immediately. Miller took this as a sign of submission and strutted down the steps, his hand resting casually on the grip of his taser. He loomed over her, blocking the sun, smelling of chewing tobacco and aggressive cologne. "I'm talking to you," he sneered, leaning in so close she could see the pores on his nose. "Where do you think you're going? This is a courthouse, not a soup kitchen. We don't allow loitering." Evelyn finally looked up, meeting his gaze with eyes that were calm, dark, and utterly unafraid. "I'm going to the hearing," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's a public proceeding, officer. I have a right to be here." The silence that followed was heavy. The crowd held its breath. Nobody spoke to Buck Miller like that, not if they wanted to walk home. Miller's face turned a violent shade of crimson. In his mind, a black woman in a hoodie quoting rights wasn't a citizen. She was a threat to his authority. "Rights," he laughed, a cruel barking sound. "You have rights when I say you have rights. Let me see some ID." Evelyn didn't move to open her purse. She knew that if she showed him her ID now, he would realize who she was. He would panic, apologize, and cover his tracks. She needed him to commit the crime. "I am not operating a vehicle, and I am not suspected of a crime," Evelyn stated, reciting the law from memory. "Therefore, I am not required to identify myself to enter a public building." Miller stepped closer, bumping her chest with his own. "Listen to me, you smart-mouthed little punk," he hissed. "I can find a crime. I can find a drug charge. I can find a weapon. I can find whatever I need to put you in a cage for 10 years. Now turn around and get off my steps before I lose my patience." Evelyn stood her ground, her heart hammering but her feet planted like roots. "If you touch me," she whispered, "you will be making the biggest mistake of your career." That was the moment Miller snapped. He didn't just want to arrest her. He wanted to destroy her. He wanted to show the crowd what happens when you challenge the king. "Is that a threat?" he screamed, playing to the cameras he knew were watching. "She's resisting. She's threatening an officer." He didn't wait for her to respond. He kicked her legs out from under her with a vicious sweep. Evelyn hit the stone steps hard, her hip taking the brunt of the impact, her head cracking against the concrete. White light exploded behind her eyes. Before she could catch her breath, Miller dropped his full weight onto her back, his knee driving into her spine. "Stop fighting!" he yelled, even though she was lying still. He wrenched her arms behind her back with brutal force, cranking the shoulder joints until she gasped in pain. He ratcheted the handcuffs so tight they cut off the circulation immediately. He hauled her to her feet by the chains, parading her before the crowd. "Take a good look!" Miller shouted, shaking her like a rag doll. "This is what happens when trash forgets its place." He kicked her purse, the purse containing her badge, into the dirt and dragged her toward the side entrance, fully convinced he was the hero of the story. They threw her into the holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, a small windowless concrete box that smelled of urine and stale bleach. Miller shoved her onto the wooden bench so hard her head banged against the cinder block wall. He didn't read her rights. He didn't process her. He just stood in the doorway, adjusting his uniform, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "You stay here and think about your attitude," he mocked, pointing a finger in her face. "I gotta go testify against your thug friend inside. When I come back, I'm gonna book you for assault on a public official. That's a felony, sweetheart. You're never seeing the sun again." He laughed and slammed the heavy metal door, locking it. Inside the small room, Evelyn sat alone with Officer Jenkins, the rookie partner who had watched the whole arrest with a look of unease. Jenkins was young, barely 22, and he looked terrified of Miller. He stood by the door, avoiding Evelyn's gaze. Evelyn took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Officer," she said, her voice strained but commanding, "I need some water." Jenkins shook his head nervously. "Miller said no special treatment." Evelyn looked at him. "Son, look at me. Miller isn't going to be your boss in 10 minutes. But I might be." Jenkins finally looked at her, confused by the authority in her tone. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, checking the door to make sure Miller wasn't listening. Evelyn leaned forward, the handcuffs clinking. "My purse," she said. "Miller kicked it into the hallway. Go get it." Jenkins shook his head. "I can't. That's evidence." Evelyn's eyes bored into him. "That purse contains a federal warrant. If you don't open that door and get it right now, you will be named as an accessory to a kidnapping." The rookie froze. He saw the blood on her lip, but he also saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. It was a gamble, but his gut told him Miller had gone too far. Trembling, Jenkins unlocked the door. He retrieved the dirty, scuffed purse from the floor and handed it to her. "Open the inside pocket," Evelyn ordered. Jenkins unzipped it. He pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open. The gold badge of the state attorney general caught the fluorescent light, gleaming like a star. Jenkins gasped, nearly dropping the wallet. He looked at the mugshot, ID, then at the battered woman on the bench. His face went pale white. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God, we're dead." "Uncuff me," Evelyn ordered. Jenkins fumbled for his keys, his hand shaking so hard it took him 3 tries to find the lock. The moment the metal clicked open, Evelyn stood up. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't check her reflection. She smoothed her hoodie and picked up the badge. "Open the courtroom doors," she said. Jenkins hesitated. "But Miller is on the stand." "Exactly," Evelyn said. Jenkins pushed the double doors open. The courtroom was hushed, the air conditioning humming. Miller was sitting in the witness box, looking relaxed, lying to the judge about the teenager. He turned when the doors opened, annoyed at the interruption. He expected to see Jenkins. Instead, he saw the trash he had beaten, walking down the center aisle with the stride of a conqueror. "Your Honor!" Miller stood up, pointing. "That's her! That's the woman! Arrest her!" The judge, confused, looked at the bailiffs, but Evelyn didn't stop. She walked straight past the bailiffs, marched up to the prosecutor's table, and slammed her gold shield onto the wood. The sound cracked through the room like a thunderclap. "Officer Miller!" she boomed, her voice projecting to the back row. "You are under arrest." The silence that descended on the courtroom was absolute. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the building. Miller stared at the badge on the table, his brain struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He looked at the judge, expecting his golf partner to save him, but the judge was staring at Evelyn's ID with a look of pure horror. "Ms. Vance," the judge stammered. his face turning gray. We didn't know." Miller's arrogance crumbled into dust. "It's a fake!" he screamed, desperation clawing at his throat. "She stole it! She's a liar!" Evelyn didn't even look at him. She turned to the back of the room and nodded. The doors swung open again, and 4 state troopers in full uniform marched in. They didn't walk like local cops, they walked like soldiers. They surrounded the witness stand. "Officer Miller," the lead trooper said, "stand up and place your hands behind your back." Miller looked at the troopers, then at Evelyn. He saw the blood on her lip. He saw the bruise forming on her cheek. And finally, he saw the truth. He started to cry. It wasn't a noble cry. It was the pathetic sobbing of a bully who had finally met someone stronger. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked at Evelyn, pleading, "I was just doing my job. You were wearing a hoodie." Evelyn stepped close to him, letting the whole room hear her. "Justice," she whispered. "Doesn't have a dress code." The fallout from that afternoon was swift, brutal, and public. The video of Miller abusing the Attorney General was broadcast on every major news network in the country. It became the lead story, a symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. But Evelyn didn't just fire Miller. She dismantled the entire town's corrupt infrastructure. She stayed in Oak Creek for 3 months, leading a task force that audited every arrest Miller had made in the last 10 years. They found evidence of planted drugs, stolen money, and coerced confessions. The sheriff was indicted. 2 other deputies were fired. The judge was forced into early retirement to avoid prosecution. And Tyrell, the teenager Miller had framed, was released that same day, walking out of the courthouse into the arms of his mother, while Miller was driven away in the back of a van, destined for a federal penitentiary where badges offered no protection. Years later, Evelyn Vance still keeps the gray hoodie. It hangs in a glass case in her office at the state capitol, a reminder of the day she had to become a victim to save a town. She never fixed the small scar on her lip. She wears it like a medal of honor. When she speaks to graduating classes of police recruits, she tells them the story of Oak Creek. She tells them about the heat, the pain of the concrete, and the feeling of helplessness. But mostly she tells them about the look in Miller's eyes, the absolute certainty that he could hurt her because she looked like trash. She ends every speech with the same warning, a warning that stays with every officer who hears it. The most dangerous weapon in that courtroom wasn't a gun. It was his assumption. He assumed I was nothing, and that assumption cost him his life. When you look at a citizen, never forget, you serve them. Because the moment you think you are better than the people you protect, you are no longer an officer. You are a criminal waiting to be caught.